Sheena and moderated by Vijay. Vijay needs no introduction. He's the festival director and professor of English. Over to you, Vijay.
Thank you so much. And as I said, the bios are there in the tabloid. So those who are interested in the longer bios can refer to that. Since we are starting about 2 minutes behind schedule, please note that we will have our full 50 minutes. Okay, thank you. Yeah, very quickly, ladies and gentlemen, this is Michelle Cahill, and author of the book, Daisy and Wolf. And this is Sheena Patel on my left, and she's the author of I'm a Fan. The two books, I will come to that in a minute, but there is a special significance to these books. Both are their debut novels, both Michelle and Sheena. This is, of course, they have published earlier, but this is their first novel. And I will try to, what should I say, talk about this book is the Indian edition of the original book. The original book came out in 23, right? 22. This was the original book that came out in 22, and the Indian edition is absolutely fresh. It hasn't actually been formally released, right? Yeah. But there is an interesting, apart from being the first books of the two authors, there is something very interesting about Daisy and Wolf. What Daisy and Wolf does is that it takes a character, a very minor character from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and reimagines that character. More about that later. But also, interestingly, if you remember, Mrs. Dalloway is exactly 100 years old. It was first published in 1925. And so, 100 years later, a minor character from Virginia Woolf's classic novel, Mrs. Dalloway, is reimagined and turned into a full-fledged character. What she does, etc., we will talk about that. And Sheena Patel's novel, that's there in front of you, is an extremely, what should I say, intense, disturbing novel, both in terms of its content, but also in terms of its form. I will not say too much about them. I will let the authors talk about it. Let me first begin with Sheena. I think probably because I'm slightly left-oriented, maybe. So let me, Sheena, but before we come to this book, I want to take you back a couple of years to a very interesting collaborative effort that you made with 3 other writers. And this is a collaborative project called 4 Brown Girls Writing. Let me also tell you that Sheena is from the UK and Michelle is from Australia. 4 Brown Girls Writing is a collective effort project of 4 South Asian origin women writing in the UK. And so I would like to take you back to that, tell us a little bit about this collaborative effort and why such collaborations are important.
So we started, it's 4 Brown Girls Who Write, but I like 4 Brown Girls Writing as well. I'll suggest it as a name change. But we decided to start that because we didn't know how to write. And so we started that to support one another. So rather than wait for a publisher to come in and tell us, this is the way you do it, or this is what you write, we just decided to do it ourselves. So we thought if we started something, the publishers will come to us rather than us have to go to them.
Yeah, but also, you know, you said that it's because instead of waiting for a publisher to publish it, etc., does it also, in a way, take away the entire, let us say, the vetting process and all that? Does it? I know I'm asking this in the larger context of self-publishing. So there are pluses and minuses to it, right? So what was your thinking process when? By the way, let me also tell you that the title of that project comes from a WhatsApp group that they created among the four of themselves. And the WhatsApp group name also became the title of that project. But in terms of, uh, did you evaluate each other's work, or did you become completely autonomous that I write my thing and you write your thing and four of us will put it together and bring it forward?
A, a bit, well, we all wrote individually, but then when we self-published, and I'd say it's more like the DIY scene, which is very good in the UK, where you just do something. And I thought rather than wait, we should just crack on and just, ooh, that's loud. We should just crack on and publish it. And it wasn't just publishing, it was also performances and events, and we would host events, so we would bring other black and brown authors and writers and performers with us. We took a show up to it's called the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. It's quite a big arts festival in the UK, and we took a show up there for a week because it was really expensive, so we could only do a week. We could only get a week off work. So it was just about doing stuff rather than sitting down and writing and nothing coming of it. It was to take it out of your room or out of your house so that you were connecting with people and connecting with each other and pushing one another forward. But we didn't really have much technical knowledge. We just did stuff and published it even if there were mistakes. It was just to publish it.
Yeah, I think that's something connected to the form of the book, this book, in terms of this taking it out and presenting. But I'll come to that in a minute, but I want to shift to Michelle. And Michelle, again, very interesting. And now probably you can understand where the title of the session comes from, because both of them are in a way doing something, taking something out of the margins, whether it is the brown girls writing or a minor character from Mrs. Dalloway, and putting them in the center. And Michelle, tell me where and when and how did this idea of taking a minor character from a classic and turning or reimagining that character, how did it begin and so on?
Thanks, Vijay. So basically, really, I am a minority myself, and all my writing work has been about how do you bring the minority narrative into the mainstream so that it can, have a voice, have agency, because ultimately storytelling is very empowering. It enables, it elevates, the dignity of our lives. And so often minorities are spoken for within mainstream media, but also within the literary canon. And so, yeah, I've been working on it for a while, I started out, like Sheena, I started out in poetry, because it's very, really my reality or my imaginings started out as fragments. So I started looking at the aesthetics of the fragment through poetry, and then I kind of built on that with a collection of short stories. I was always wanting to expand it. I find fiction challenging for me as a writer, and that's kind of brings a joy. However, when you are a minority, what happens is the actual structural architecture of a novel is quite challenging, because there are so many assumptions embedded within narrative, that tend to sort of flatten and, to pick up. You have to kind of always be explaining minor characters. And, so in a way, I've been looking at this for a while, and in my earlier collection of short fiction, Letter to Pessoa, I was like letters to other authors. So I was looking at metafictions and like ways in which, in some ways, it's like a tandem thing. It's kind of like, a little bit closer. In some ways, it becomes like a tandem narrative. You're telling this minority narrative in tandem with a more mainstream narrative. So you're questioning what I was trying to do in Daisy and Wolf is like questioning the universality of the white feminist who's speaking for others, but you know, often flattening out those differences, and if that makes sense. So and yeah, basically it was a long-term thing to come to that point where and I think
I think we have reached a stage now where we no longer talk about feminism in the singular, and we talk about feminisms. But again, if I at the risk of repeating myself, when did and how did this idea of taking something from Mrs. Dalloway and turning it into a full-fledged novel, how did that happen?
yeah, well, what happened was I'd read Mrs. Dalloway when I was younger, like I guess a lot of us, and my background is on my father's side I was Anglo-Indian, and on my mother's side I was Goan, and it's always been so hard in Australia. Identifying as Indian is very difficult. In India, identifying as Indian is also difficult, and I'm just sharing that as background, but. Yeah, I was reading it. I was doing a doctorate project and I was reading Mrs. Dalloway, and I saw there that Daisy Simmons, that Peter Walsh is an Anglo-Indian character, and it's something I'd never known before in the novel. Even I think I'd sort of like skimmed over it and not recognised that, and that he had come to London. The purpose for his return to London, Mrs. Dalloway, is one day in the life of a British aristocrat who's arranging a party, and Peter Walsh has come to London. But the reason he'd come to London was to actually arrange Daisy Simmons' divorce. And every time she's described in Mrs. Dalloway, the word dark is used. The dark, every single time. And what I was annoyed about was that after 100 years of research, including researchers who had actually looked at the Indian aspects of Mrs. Dalloway, like one researcher had written a 35-page essay on it, that they were calling her the British woman, you know, or that they were calling her the English woman. They were whitewashing the mixed ancestry people, her community. She didn't have a family. She was never described in Mrs. Dalloway with her family in a house, in a city. We don't even know where she lives. It's so little, but every single time she's mentioned, it's the dark, the dark, adorable. There's also cliches of deprecative cliches as well. And so I really wanted to kind of give her all that had been taken away from her, and also things that had been taken away from my community as a result of colonialism. It's like, how do we restore the things that are taken away? And it's really just like little by little we build. It's not something that can be done with one book or one project. It's just all, a lifetime's like little struggles of like working towards.
Yeah, I think that's something that I will come back to this, because I'm reminded of something that Chinua Achebe talks about, what Conrad does in Heart of Darkness, but I'll come to that. Sheena, Michelle was talking about restoring voice, right, to people who have been silenced. And many of those who have read and reviewed your novel constantly use one word which is recurrent, which is voice, right? Tell us a little bit about what is your idea of giving that voice to the brown girls in this book. Of course, this is a very different. I also want to see the connections between what you contributed to that project and if there is anything that is connected to this novel.
As in with the Four Brown Girls and
Yeah.
this. Well, I read a book called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, and in it she sort of rips second generation authors for the way that they cater to whiteness and how vulnerability is actually, it works against black and brown authors because displaying pain is a way for white liberal people to feel good about themselves because they're like, oh, I'm here reading a story from a brown person, I'm not racist. And so I felt sick because the whole point of Four Brown Girls was to be about being vulnerable, and I realised that everything that I thought was radical wasn't radical, and so that in part that sort of fed into this because I didn't want to be vulnerable. I didn't want to display humanity or pain or anything. I wanted to be aggressive and dangerous. And I mean, it's very strange to be I've never been to India before, and it's like everybody's brown. I know that's like a very basic thought, but it's like, but you're not a minority here. So it's very strange to say this because there can't be that sort of mindset here because you are the majority here. So the idea of being a marginalised person must be very strange to hear. But in Britain, especially in the arts, you are a marginalised person. You are seen as other. And so I thought I'll inhabit that other, and I'll be the threat that they think that we are. And another thing is there's a girl, or she's a woman now, but her name's Shamima Begum, and she's Bangladeshi and British Bangladeshi, and she became an ISIS bride at like 15 and had a baby in a camp in Syria, and then this Tory MP stripped her citizenship, and it was so devastating to me. And I'm not saying I agree with what she did, but she was 15, and if she was a white girl, she would have been brought home, and they would have been like, "You poor innocent thing, you got totally mugged off by these people." But instead, she's treated as a criminal. Her baby died. She's still. They told her to go back to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh said no. She doesn't know Bangladesh. It was just very disturbing to me. So I had her in mind when I was writing this because I thought, what is the worst thing that I could do, or write a character? What could they do to threaten being deported in a way?
I mean, is that where the other prominent character of your novel comes from, which is anger? There is so much anger in that novel. And so I was wondering, is that constant pressure of identity, is that where that anger comes from?
I think there's a lot of things to be angry about, and especially and I was angry, and so it was a good place to put it. Was to put it in the voice. It was a good place to put it. So I wanted to push what I thought was acceptable. It's also it's not a very palatable voice. It's not a nice world. There's no love, and the love comes very minimally when it comes. So it's not a very forgiving place. And sometimes it is a bit weird reading from it like so long after writing it, but it's very much a pandemic novel though, because I was on my own so much when I wrote it, and I was really angry about a lot of things, and I'm still angry about those things, but I think anger as a woman is an emotion that you're not supposed to inhabit. So it was nice to be able to inhabit that.
Yeah, I thought that being that intense anger and putting it out there was one other way of kind of breaking a stereotype of a completely not necessarily docile, but the usual stereotype of women is something, very tolerant, very, so I thought, that anger was part of the larger idea of, breaking those shackles of identity that are imposed on women. And I mean, so adding to the race question, also there is this gender question, right? That gets combined with it. So, you know, Michelle, I want to take you back to what you said about restoring things that have been taken away from them, deprived from them. One of them, of course, is voice. But the other thing is, again, to go back to what Achebe said about Conrad, the two things that Heart of Darkness does to Africans in the Heart of Darkness was to deprive them of one representation, self-representation, and the other is history. History is something that is denied to African, and speech is denied to African. So, in a way, self-representation and history. So, the first part, one understands that you are giving, this character Daisy, as reimagined by Mina in the contemporary world, a kind of a voice and self-representation. But what about history? How much of that you have been able to give to the character who has been deprived of that?
Yeah, so, I think, there's this shift towards the present and focus on the present and also futures as well. And I see the value of that. But also, I think one of the issues that comes up with history is that it's often in fragments. So, like the archive is in fragments, and so there's a lot of work you have to do to build that complete picture, that complete reality, I guess, which does end up generating agency, essentially, without a history. And I think there's a part in the novel where I say, without a history, without an argument, I think that's what I said, without a history, without an argument, Daisy's story is like, it could be a romance, or it could be, it doesn't have that anchorage and that's what I think minorities are missing, and that's what the struggle is, because it's also, if we're just looking to the future, and that's great, and what the future can be like, but also, like, let's not forget what the past has been, and understand where, at what points, what's been taken away, and how we can reconstruct. I mean, basically, I was reconstructing, and in many ways, I didn't really realise all that I was doing. It was funny, I gave a talk in Hobart in December, and I selected some sections from the book and talked a little bit about what I'd done. It was an academic talk on modernism, actually. And so it was like the most, like I was a bit nervous about that. But afterwards I felt really emotional, and I'd like to share this with you. I felt really emotional and just like couldn't even do anything, couldn't eat and everything, and for a few hours. And I thought, it's 2 years since the book's been published. What I really did in the book is like restorative of what colonialism has taken away for the mixed ancestry people when, and today's like the day we think about the Constitution, And for me, one of the things is like, I think in 2019, the Constitution was amended again to sort of, again, further sort of take away sort of representations. It's an ongoing thing. And I think that's what fiction can do. Fiction can sort of, argue back in a way, I guess, and, reimagine, restore that way. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think, history does, of course, give you an anchorage to it also gives a kind of a platform from which you can create a counter narrative, right? But when it comes to the whole question of archive, and we are all familiar with Foucault's argument about archive building, so archive building also is a kind of a European Western project. What gets archived, what doesn't get archived, again, is a big debate, right? So how much can we, I mean, if we are looking at the mainstream archives, right, we are in a way not actually challenging what we want to challenge. So what would be a kind of an alternative archive, which can be drawn upon?
So I think, like you're quite right, like the whole thing about colonialism is embedded in education. It's like, and publications and, and we're seeing this, and that's what I love about Sheena's book as well, because you're talking about industry. I think I sort of dipped into industry a lot as well as the narrator who's telling the story. There's two narrators. One's a contemporary narrator. She sort of like gets an agent, and that sort of, she sort of like talks about those like backstories with the agent and how, it's going to be a flawed situation because she is a minority and she's navigating those publication barriers, so I think, oral storytelling and also creative storytelling and reimagining the past is, I think Edward Said actually talked about it. He talked about it as a thing that we have to do to writing back and imagining what's been taken away from us. And when we talk about history, what's really big for me is narrative justice. That's such a huge thing for me. I sort of, it sounds a bit like lofty, but I'm going to share this with you. But I hunger for it. I hunger for narrative justice because this is my country as well. My parents were born here, both of my parents. I wasn't born here. I haven't lived here, but it wasn't my choice to not to be born here. I want to be here. I come here a lot. And when I do come here, I don't have the fluency of language. It's been taken away from me. And, it's something, that's a wound I have. Every single day of my life, it's been taken away. That's what history is about to me. It's something very palpable. It's something about walking in India and saying, you know what? I'm part of this country. I'm part of this nation. And the only way that I can contribute is by telling my story and threading back to my family and their lives and their stories, and then a bigger community. And then someone like Daisy Simmons, what was her story and how does she fit into the picture? What are these London socialites talking about over morning tea with Clarissa Dalloway when they're talking about the coolies' wives, right? And they have this idea of, and there's this Indian character and she's never given a voice. Even like the working class women in Mrs. Dalloway have more of a situation and a context than Daisy Simmons does. So I think, there's no doubt about the fact that the Wolves were inherently quite racist, and I think it's important for us to be able to say that because in many ways we've sort of deified, we've sort of glorified the sort of like the European who's come to, all the parts of so-called empire, whether it be Sri Lanka, whether it be Ceylon or whether it be Burma. We're sort of like, looking up to them because they had the prestige, they had the so-called authority, the authority of the archive, the authority of the libraries, the institutions, the authority of the education and the schooling system and the universities that were sort of like copied. And it's so interesting coming to India because sometimes I think, in some ways, although India wants to sort of move into its own and everything, and it has done that in so many ways, but we still mimic the West and those institutions, right? Yeah. Sorry, am I waxing on there?
Yeah, I think that narrative justice is a very good point. Probably in the next amendment to the Constitution, one can also add that to the Indian Constitution. But Michelle, I would like you to, choose a very short passage that you think is representative of this. And while you do that, while you look for that, I would like to, come back to Sheena to talk about what I mentioned earlier about the format of the novel. The format of the novel is very interesting. In an older generation, I don't know what it would have been called, and also because she also has experience of working in the media, the visual media. Probably it would have been called a kind of snapshots, but I suppose these days it will be called Instagram posts. So very short, a page and a half chapters. And her novel is full of those short, what people have called a kind of a like an Instagram posts. Was it part of the larger design of going against the stereotype of how a novel should be, what the form of a novel should be, or was it something that came kind of organically to you?
Well, I think calling it Instagram posts isn't a nice thing to call it, but I feel like that lessens the intention. But for me, what I had in mind was I read a lot of scripts because I work in television, so I thought I'd structure it like TV, where time doesn't really matter. So I'd jump from the past to the present and disorientate the reader. But also, I didn't really know how to write a novel, so I thought if I did it in bits, that might make it a bit easier for me, because I didn't know how to do plot, and I still don't know how to do plot. So I just thought I'd hack it and break it up a bit. But also, I listened to this podcast by Ocean Vuong, and he said that the form of a novel, of like the 3 parts of a novel, comes from a lineage that perhaps wouldn't have let him in. So he's gay, so he called it queering the novel. And I thought that was a really interesting way of seeing it, of like enabling him to access the medium. So I thought, okay, I'll do the sort of the same thing, which is I love reading, I love books, and I don't say this without the love of my heart, but I thought I'll destroy what I think a novel is and make my own way. But actually, it's not really my own way. It's not anything original, because there's many novels that are like this way. It's just a little bit different. It's just about the internet, so then people think Instagram posts, but there's many like proper novels that do this.
No, in fact, each of those very short chapters also have a title, right? And I said Instagram because I don't use social media, so I don't know all this animal called social media. So I don't know Instagram, but interestingly, several reviews talked about it, and I have no intention of undermining the intensity of it. Then I thought, okay, if so many people are calling it Instagram-like, it must be like that because I don't know what Instagram posts are like. So it's in a way not my question. I was asking that question on behalf of all those reviewers who have read that. But very interestingly, again, as I said, coming from an old school, I always thought that those kind of a snapshots were more like a kind of a television, and I thought I'm making that connection between your experience in the visual media and your writing. It did look to me like a kind of a, I don't know, not even an episode, but it's like framing of each scene in a particular visual presentation. It's almost like one slide each, right? So that's why I thought it was
and
that.
I'm not really upset.
Yes, of course, because I was thinking of the great F.R. Leavis, the great tradition, and how novels should be written, etc. I thought, this is well, the very fact that the novel survives is because it has never been kind of frozen into one particular form, right? So, Michelle, are you ready with a short passage?
Yes, sure.
And do you think you can do a quick reading after this?
I just wanted to say as well that I've got 2 narrators. So one's a contemporary narrator, and it's set in 2017, and the Trumps just brought in the ban on Muslims travelling, and there's a whole lot of stuff happening that's like challenging for people of colour. So it is very much in that context. And the narrator she's an Australian writer who is in London, and she's trying to write this novel. And then the other character, so it goes from 2017 to in 1924, and that's Daisy's story, but there's also kind of letters from Daisy to Peter, and then there's letters from Peter, and there's also, as I got braver, I thought I'd be able to take on Peter's letters and other people's letters from, and just build the story that way. But I just explain that by way of saying that my contemporary narrator also often is quoting social media, and she's sort of talking about taking selfies, and she's talking about how that, you know, she's often checked, like I've just got a little quote that I've got here, just opening it up. This wasn't the intended passage, but I'll just say, you know, on Facebook, a note from a friend who's been teaching creative writing at RMIT to ask if I'd like some sessions, feel dull with fatigue and this raspy throat. I close the computer and head out to Boots near South Kensington Station for headache pills and cough lozenges. So it's very much like her daily life, but there's a lot of references to, you know, not Instagram. I think that reflects my age. Sheena, that's like more like the Facebook and Twitter X. So, yeah, I think it's really a part of, like, who we are, like, so the narrator's constructing her identity from these fragments. But I thought I'd just read a very brief passage. This is when she's in Kolkata. And I thought it might be something to think about, just that might resonate, I suppose, today, just in terms of us as global community and the people who are left out of the story, the people who are marginalised in our lives. At Diamond Harbour, I sat on a coconut vendor's chaise as he skillfully peeled the green skin and the pale flesh with his curved knife, right down to the nut, so I could drink the refreshing, gauzy milk. Students were walking past. Under the sun's radiance, the morning heat became suffocating. I walked the banks of the Hooghly River, past the boat builders' wharves. For half a mile I walked, stepping across the railway sleepers, past the weeds and the slum dwellings, following the train tracks till I reached a poor man's gat. Skinny, half-naked boys were bathing and dogs kept watch, pulling at their leashes. On my way back, I was followed by an overweight man who assumed I was a sex worker and offered me a lift. I felt cheap. His stare devoured me. When I got into a taxi, he tapped on the window. In the lurid daylight, there were orphans asleep on mats at the intersections of roads. Children who suffer as much from the cliches of poverty as from poverty itself. Starvation in the sunken eyes of infants sitting on stools at the entrance to the underground. Near a sari shop, I caught a flicker of life in the eyes of thin-boned beggars, barely visible in the dirt and the darkness. They were piled in a bullock cart parked opposite St. Thomas's Church. One night, I ate at a food stall in a street market, then became sick. An adolescent boy was serving, dressed in coarse cotton, scratching his legs and his rump through the loose trousers. I bought saris in a leather bag and recall now with nostalgia sitting on a school, drinking tea and talking with a leather goods spender as the sun blazed in his shop front on Charangi Road. Not speaking the same language means that something is bound to be lost in the process of translation. Sometimes, even though we are global, I was the one who was exploited. Other times it was the locals. The engineer I met over breakfast working in Sikkim on developing a one belt, one road project said, "We should go out in Park Street." He seemed fine, he spoke good English, but then sent a crass, lewd text. So I deleted him from WhatsApp, even before we were supposed to meet a lucky escape. And the beautiful Muslim woman, a merchant's wife from Patna, who was noticeably tense because she was locked out of her room with her baby while her husband was out at a meeting. Veiled yet vulnerable, she was afraid of the housekeepers. It was too risky to wait alone in the corridor, even with her young and slender body covered. She feared the heat, the sweat stains it left on her kurta. She was so grateful When I invited her to stay in my room till it was sorted out, I gave her bottled water and she breastfed her son. Coming from the West, we forget this kind of gender hatred is being normalised. The women from Patna and Bangladesh stayed together, catching taxis, finding protection from the sun. How strange it was, I thought, that we should meet like that, the writer and the young married mother from Patna.
Thank you so much. Just one word about this book. Would you like to tell the audience what this book about? Because this is a book about a woman who is obsessed with a much older man who is actually running after another woman. And this woman is stalking the other woman and putting her frustration out there in these short outbursts.
Okay. You're on your own, kid. I come back home almost exactly the way I left it, my punt at rebellion, squashed quite spectacularly. It is a humiliating homecoming, and I have nothing to show for 10 years of working, almost no financial solvency. The relationship with my family is so fraught that it is traumatic to share the same living space with them again. Years and years of resentment and grudges and misunderstandings roll like thunder under the carpet. The rain soaks the walls in the living room. The water saturates the ceiling. 3 nights after I move back in, my brother tears through the house and we have a screaming match, bringing up old grudges from when he was 13. A cousin texts and says, "I think you made a mistake. You should stay with your boyfriend." The implication being you're too old to be single. 2 of our closest friends stopped speaking to me for a year because the end of the relationship means the end of Heartbreak Hotel. When I tell the man I want to be with that I've broken up with my boyfriend, he texts back, "I hope you didn't do this because of me." A week after I move back home, we meet in a pub in Bow. I'm hyper and fraught, but I think I'm being normal and sexy. He breaks his 1 kiss per meeting rule and kisses me spontaneously inside the pub and says afterwards, "I kissed you so you would calm down, you were spiraling." I go to the toilet thinking he'll be watching me as I walk away, completely enthralled by me. I glance back and he's looking at his phone. When I'm in the cubicle, I do not go for a wee. I keep my trousers up. I stand and do nothing, upright in the too narrow cubicle like I'm standing in my own grave. I walk to the sinks and look at my reflection in the mirror. I stare at my face mutated under the spotlights, my features morphing into the mask of hysteric. My eyes are barely contained panic in a tense face. I'm waiting for the man I want to be with to tell me he will be with me. I am down like a runner poised for the sound of the starting gun, and then I will run and run and run and run. Someone walks in and it startles me. I pretend I finish washing my hands and put them under the dryer. I am performing all the time, performing being myself. What is myself? Who is me? I step back out into the pub and he is still on his phone like the bored receptionist at the mouth of hell. I stand next to him so he will notice me. He doesn't, and I keep standing, waiting for a command which doesn't come.
Thank you so much. That's 1 chapter, by the way, right?
Not the whole novel.
Yeah, but see the intensity of those short chapters. It's like, it's like the kind of frustration of a woman who wants a definite answer from the man that she is obsessed with. And the answer could be no, I'm not interested. But he's not willing to give that yes or no. And this woman desperately needs him to give that, 1 word, yes or no, which is, the kind of a tense relationship that they have between them is something that comes out in these outbursts. Thank you, Sheena. Yeah, I think now I will open up if you have any questions. And the warning is that if you don't have questions, then I will continue the conversation. Yeah, yeah.
My question is to Sheena. Sheena, I don't know how active you are on Instagram right now, but there's a lot of Instagram therapy going on and a lot of labeling of things like with just the summary, I could say that, okay, this is a situationship happening. So, so does this kind of labeling come in when you think about writing such things? Because when I think like, why do I need to explain these things? I can just simply say it's a situationship. But also, I think it takes away the value of that experience that people feel. So has that come across as well?
No, is the answer. But I don't think thinking in labels is very helpful because it's just a way to bypass an emotion. So, no, I didn't know about that word when I was writing this, but that word came up. I started to see that word after I wrote it. But, I mean, it is a funny word, and it is this situation, but no, I wasn't thinking about that. But also, it's actually about power, and that's what I was more interested in. It's one person withholding and another person yearning, and one person having low self-esteem, really. So, but what I was more interested in is the roots of that low self-esteem, and that's from the world that you live in that tells you you're worth something or you're not, and then what you're able to tolerate in a romantic relationship is based on that as well, on the value that the world tells you you have.
Yeah. Any other? I think, one of the things that I found very interesting in both these novels is the question of power that she was talking about. Um, who has the voice and who represents whom, and who, in a way, controls the relationship, both in terms of race or in terms of gender. If you have noticed that last line where she comes and stands next to him, waiting him to recognize or at least feel her presence, it is up to him to decide whether he wants to acknowledge her presence or not. So I think the whole idea of power relationships, both in terms of race in her novel and gender in Sheena's novel, something that to me underlies two different novels in two different contexts, but something that is very, I would say. Okay, let me ask you this very personal question, if you don't mind. How much of a cathartic effect, the novels had? Because, the first novels are always like, you put out everything that you wanted to say. So how much of, and particularly, when you are writing this with a particular background, in terms of the brown girls kind of a situation that you are in, then, the whole question of identity, etc. How much of a kind of a cathartic effect these novels had?
I didn't. For me, I didn't find it cathartic. I was terrified because I felt like I was pushing the boundary of what was acceptable. It's like I go after British South Asian creatives and women, and it's not very forgiving. So I thought I'd get cancelled. Really, I was like, "Oh, I'll get one shot at this, and then we'll see what happens to me." But I didn't think it would have the reception that it had in Britain, or at least in London. So I was quite surprised by that. But there were 3 months where I was like terrified. So it wasn't really. It was only cathartic when I started to get the good reviews.
Yeah. What about you, Michelle?
I don't know. I think.
Or okay, let me put it this way. If not catharsis, did you feel kind of fulfilled that you have been able to kind of come closer to what you wanted to write and what you wanted to achieve through that writing?
I think it's about time. Like, one of the things I had to do, it was cathartic in the sense that at one point I had to make a decision of whether I sort of thought, oh my God, look what I've done. Like, this is really massive. And what was I thinking? Like, why did what was I thinking? And I sort of was wondering whether I tell the publisher, like, I need another year, like. And then I was in a beautiful place. It was by the sea and it was very remote. And I thought, I kind of like realised that I could stand against Virginia Woolf. I knew my stuff. I've been working on this stuff for a long time, and I'm not her. I don't come from an elite or an aristocratic background. I've come from an ordinary middle-class background. but I could stand with her. Like her, I'm also a literary editor. Like her, I've also written experimental fiction. She had a lot of Indian connections. Her mother was born in India. Her great aunt was born in India. So there was, and a lot of her relatives. There was a lot of connections. But obviously, you know, we were worlds apart. But when I kind of came to the realisation that I could do this, I could stand on my own, I could speak eloquently, and it was also a homage to her. I mean, there's lots of beautiful things about her work, and in no way was it just a one-way attack on her work. You know, it was more of a, let's take this conversation further. You know, I looked at A Room of One's Own, and it's all the poets that she mentions in A Room of One's Own are British, except for Aphra Behn. You know, they're all white women that she's talking about, and it is really time for us to sort of like go further. So in that sense, there was a sense of satisfaction and achievement. Yeah.
Yeah. I think standing up to Virginia Woolf and standing up to the entire literary establishment, you know, in Sheena's case, and I think that's a wonderful rebellious note to end this session. Thank you so much, Sheena, and thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you so
Thank you
much,
so much.
Vijay. Thanks, Jane.